Episode 98. Snow, ice, wind, deep, deep water, and fevered sneezes. Gorgeous, sparkling, swaying trees. Winter in Pawtuxet. Greetings and welcome into the Pawtuxet General. I am your host, Jess. It has been a minute or two since we talked last. The entire staff of the General finally succumbed to COVID, like nearly everyone else in the past few years. So we took a little enforced time off. In this time, we had the opportunity to take a leisurely look at the General itself. I was amazed to see that we have listeners from all over the world. Welcome to our regular listeners in Canada, Germany, the UK, Australia, Japan, Romania, Israel, Spain, Singapore, Nigeria, and Ireland. Welcome in, folks. We're tickled to have you. However, let us not forget my special friends right here in Warwick and Cranston, Rhode Island, or our devoted New Hampshire and New York listeners. Thanks to you, my heart grew 3 times its size and broke out of its box just like the Grinch. I would like to thank you all by name, if I knew them, but I would be here until next week. So instead, I will simply say, thank you, constant listener. I would also like to thank our Patreon subscribers. These folks make it possible for us to be able to bring you this entertainment every week. They are integral. In the hot fudge sundae that is the Pawtuxet General, they are the strawberry, vanilla, and chocolate ice cream, bananas, fudge sauce, whipped cream, nuts, dish, and napkin, without whom we would merely be an empty spoon. So, let's all thank them. Thank you. If you would like to be one of these dessert-minded folk, simply follow the link in our show notes, or look for our page on patreon.com. Until then, let's talk about champagne. It is probable that you had a glass of champagne or 2 over the holidays. Have you ever stopped to ask why? This story is the story of grapes, seasons, bottles, widows, and monks. We start with the migration of Pinot Noir grapes. Romans brought the plants for their own winemaking to the area, which is now known as Champagne. These particular grapes behave differently in this new climate. When in the casks during the winter months, the fermentation process stopped, only to come out of hibernation in the spring. This produced carbonation, and it was not popular. Many hundreds of years were committed to reducing or removing the sparkle from the wines, but it took Benedictine monk Dom Perignon, a contemporary of Louis XIV, until 1668 to come up with the definitive rules for the wine. One was to use only Pinot Noir grapes, white grapes being more subject to re-fermentation. Also, the vines themselves were not allowed to grow higher than 3 feet. But, most amazingly, Perignon did not allow the grapes to be trodden on, and instead used multiple presses to help minimize the maceration of the skins. So significant was his contribution that after the passing of Louis XIV and Perignon himself, when Louis's nephew Philippe II, the Duke of Orleans, became regent of France, he celebrated with the wine, forever cementing the tie to the French aristocracy. But once their taste was piqued, the competition for business began. Part of the problem was sweetness. Boy, were these early champagnes sweet. And while the French struggled with this problem, the British embraced a drier wine. It took 3 enterprising women to change the face of champagne. In the 19th century, women were restricted by the Napoleonic Code, where they could not own a business without male familial permission. This did mean that widows were exempt. Enter Barbe Nicole Clinquot Ponsardin, Louise Pomeroy, and Lily Bollinger. In the area known as Champagne, what you don't see are the more than 200 Ks of cellars holding literally billions of champagne bottles, a testament to ingenuity. In 1798, Barbe Nicole Ponsardin married Francois Clinquot, who ran his family's small winery. When he passed in 1805, she made the stunning decision to take over the failing business. She borrowed a great deal of money from her father and used her veuve status to bring respectability to her enterprise. By 1814, after working diligently to secure a struggling and failing business, she made a fateful decision to open up a new market, Russia. She started by running the blockades, smuggling thousands of bottles across the border. Not only legal risks, but the time of year made it very dangerous to move champagne. The heat could have ruined the wine at any time, but that's not all. She had to speed up production as well. She found a way to streamline the yeast removal process by turning the bottles upside down on her perforated kitchen table. Her risks paid off by her domination of the Russian market, hence securing the moniker the Widow. The second of our widows was raised in England. Louise Pomeroy lost her husband, Alexander, in 1858, and in little over a week, she took over the family champagne house. Her masterful idea was to give her new wine a much longer period aging in the cave, thereby making a much drier wine, perfect for the less sweet-minded English market. The response was immediate, cementing the mythos of the widows, but it took Lily Bollinger, widow of the Jacques Bollinger, to dominate the American market. She traveled for 3 months all over the U.S. promoting her wine. She refined the process by aging her bottles with the leads still in there and later removing them by hand. This method creating a very special wine that is highly desired to this day. When discussing these amazing and powerful people, often it is their being women that authors find the connection. I find all women amazing and powerful, so that is not the similarity to me. I wonder about the connection between this sweet carbonated wine and death. What is it about the darkness that surrounds these widows that makes the champagne so irresistible? From the moment the Romans brought the grape until the monk himself perfected it, and finally until our dear widows spread it all over the world, champagne has been tangled up in birth, death, and rebirth. And perhaps that is why we toast with champagne on New Year's. Cheers. Blueberry muffins, a staple in every bakery, cafe, and diner in New England. But if you really want them to move, you make Jordan Marsh blueberry muffins. And I've seen at least 5 different for sure original recipes. Thanks to Yankee Magazine and the Boston Globe, I suspect that this is close to the correct one. But in all fairness, we're moving into folklore at this point. That being the case, I was lucky enough to experience these glorious fluffy giants freshly baked. In 1986, for a college job, I sold t-shirts off a cart in Boston Common, and all the vendors would gather at 8 a.m. outside the cart garage. To get there on time, I would leave an hour and a half earlier from campus and take the T to my favorite stop to let me out at the department store district. If I got there early enough and not too early, I was not only greeted by the bewitching smells of roasting chestnuts, pretzels, and coffee, but also the tantalizing aroma of blueberry muffins. I could see them through the glass as I fled past, but the line was always too long, or I was too late, or they were gone. Very rarely I got one. Sweet, tart, fluffy, light, crunchy, and they would fall apart in your mouth. Since those days, I have made a few muffins. So many, in fact, that there are a lot of listeners out there that just did a spit take at a few. I have been approached by so many folks over the years who have brought this muffin to my attention. But they, for the most part, have only one difference: the fat used. One given to me by a customer used lard. My grandmother's used shortening. I saw one from the 1970s that used vegetable oil. But the winning answer from my mom and the following article from the New York Times, which mentions the original recipe book, the New England Economical Housekeeper and Family Receipt Book, is butter. which I read cover to cover, by the way. There is no mention of any muffin or anything with blueberries in it. However, if you compare the rest of the ingredients in common with these other recipes, it must be cupcake number 2. After much deliberation, this is the correct story. Dig it. In 1985, the Times published a recipe for blueberry muffins served at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Boston, which Marion Burroughs, who adapted the recipe, judged among her favorite muffins in the city. A few years later, a reader wrote Marion to say that the best blueberry muffins in Boston were in fact from the now-closed Jordan Marsh department store. Marion tracked down and adapted that recipe so you can judge for yourself. But the origins of the Jordan Marsh recipe were unclear until 2023, when Mara Richmond of Burlington, Vermont, wrote the Times to say that the developer of the recipe was her father, Arnold Gitlin, then the executive food consultant for Allied Stores, which owned Jordan Marsh at the time. His recipe, Richmond said, was an adaptation from one in Esther Howland's 1847 cookbook, the New England Economical Housekeeper and Family Receipt Book. Everything old is new again. This version has a lot more sugar and butter and fewer eggs than the Ritz-Carlton muffins. It also calls for mashing a half a cup of berries and adding them to the batter. This produces a very moist muffin, one that will stay fresh longer. For this recipe, you will need 1/2 cup softened butter, 1 1/4 cups sugar, 2 eggs, 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract, 2 cups flour, 1/2 teaspoon salt, 2 teaspoons baking powder, 1/2 cup milk, 2 cups blueberries, washed, drained, and picked over, and 3 teaspoons of sugar. Preheat your oven to 375 degrees Fahrenheit. Then cream the butter and sugar until light. Add the eggs one at a time, beating well after each addition. Add vanilla. Sift together the flour, salt, and baking powder, and add the creamed mixture alternately with the milk. Crush 1/2 cup blueberries with a fork and mix into the batter. Fold in the remaining whole berries. Line a 12-cup standard muffin tin with cupcake liners and fill with batter. Sprinkle the 3 teaspoons sugar over the tops of the muffins and bake at 375 degrees for 30 to 35 minutes. Remove the muffins from the tin and cool for at least 30 minutes. Store uncovered, or the muffins will be too moist on the second day if they last that long. And enjoy. I want to tell you about my friend Mike and his electromagnetic pinball museum and restoration arcade. It's an all-inclusive place to relax and share anything related to modern pinball and arcade games. A group of pinball and arcade fans with an addiction to games of all kinds and Lego too. $10 gets you free play on pinball and arcade games all day. You can find them at 881 Main Street, Pawtucket, Rhode Island, or online at www.electromagneticpinballmuseum.com. And now, the continued reading of Murders in the Rue Morgue by Edgar Allan Poe. The next question is that of the mode of descent. Upon this point I had been satisfied in my walk with you around the building. About 5.5 feet from the casement in question there runs a lightning rod, and from this rod it would have been impossible for anyone to reach the window itself, to say nothing of entering it. I observed, however, that the shutters of the 4th story were of the peculiar kind called by Parisian carpenters ferrades, a kind rarely employed at the present day, but frequently seen upon very old mansion at Lyons or Bordeaux. They are in the form of an ordinary door, a single, not a folding door, except that the lower half is latticed or worked in open trellis. thus affording an excellent hold for the hands. In the present instance, these shutters are fully 3.5 feet broad. When we saw them from the rear of the house, they were both about half open, that is to say, they stood off at right angles from the wall. It is probable that the police, as well as myself, examined the back of the tenement. But if so, in looking at these facades in the line of their breadth, as they must have done, they did not perceive this great breadth itself, or, in all events, failed to take it into due consideration. In fact, having once satisfied themselves that no egress could have been made in this quarter, they would naturally bestow here a very cursory examination. It was clear to me, however, that the shutter belonging to the window at the head of the bed would, if swung fully back to the wall, reach to within 2 feet of the lightning rod. It was also evident that by exertion of a very unusual degree of activity and courage, an entrance into the window from the rod might have thus effected. By reaching to the distance of 2.5 feet, we now suppose that the shutter opened to its whole extent. A robber might have taken a firm grasp on the trellis work, letting go then his hold upon the rod, placing his feet securely against the wall, and springing boldly from it, he might have swung the shutter so as to close it, and, if we imagine the window open at the time, even might have swung himself into the room. I wish you to bear especially in mind that I have spoken of a very unusual degree of activity as requisite to success in so hazardous and so difficult a feat. It is my design to show you, first, that the thing might possibly have been accomplished, but secondly, and chiefly, I wish to impress upon your understanding the very extraordinary, the almost preternatural character of that agility which could have accomplished it. You will say, no doubt, using the language of the law, that to make out my case I should rather undervalue than insist upon the full estimation of the activity required in this matter. This may be the practice in law, but it is not in the usage of reason. My ultimate object is only the truth. My immediate purpose is to lead you to place in juxtaposition the very unusual activity of which I had just spoken with that very peculiar, shrill, or harsh, and unequal voice, about whose nationality no two persons could be found to agree, and in whose utterance no syllabification could be detected. At these words, a vague and half-formed conception of the meaning of Dupin fitted over my mind. I seemed to be on the verge of comprehension without power to comprehend. Men, at times, find themselves upon the brink of remembrance without being able, in the end, to remember. My friend went on with his discourse. "You will see," he said, "that I have shifted the question from the mode of egress to that of ingress. It was my design to convey the idea that both were effected in the same manner, at the same point. Let us now revert to the interior of the room. Let us survey the appearances here. The drawers of the bureau, it is said, had been rifled, although many articles of apparel still remain within them. The conclusion here is absurd. It is a mere guess, a very silly one, and no more. How are we to know that the articles found in the drawers were not all that these drawers had originally contained? Madame L'Espagne and her daughter lived an exceedingly retired life, saw no company, seldom went out, and had little use for numerous changes of habiliment. Those found were at least of as good quality as any likely to be possessed by those ladies. If a thief had taken any, why had he not taken the best? Why did he not take all? In a word, why did he abandon 4,000 francs in gold to encumber himself with a bundle of linen? The gold was abandoned. Nearly the whole sum mentioned by Monsieur Mignard, the banker, was discovered in bags upon the floor. I wish you, therefore, to discard from your thoughts the blundering idea of motive. engendered in the brains of the police by that portion of the evidence which speaks of money delivered at the door of the house. Coincidences 10 times as remarkable as this, the delivery of the money and murder committed within 3 days upon the party receiving it, happen to all of us every hour of our lives without attracting even momentary notice. Coincidences in general are great stumbling blocks in the way of class of thinkers who have been educated to know nothing of the theory of probabilities, that theory to which the most glorious objects of human research are indebted for the most glorious of illustration. In the present instance, had the gold been gone, the fact of its delivery 3 days before would have formed something more than a coincidence. It would have been more corroborative of this idea of motive. But under the real circumstances of this case, if we are to suppose gold is the motive of this outrage, we must also imagine the perpetrator so vacillating an idiot as to have abandoned the gold and his motive together. Keeping now steadily in mind the points of which I have drawn your attention, that peculiar voice, that unusual agility, and that startling absence of motive in a murder so singularly atrocious as this, let us glance at the butchery itself. Here is a woman strangled to death by manual strength and thrust up a chimney, head downward. Ordinary assassins employ no such modes of murder as this. Least of all do they thus dispose of the murdered. In the manner of thrusting the corpse of the chimney, you must admit that there was something excessively outrageous, something altogether irreconcilable with our common notions of human action, even when we suppose the actors the most depraved of men. Think, too, how great must have been the strength which could have thrust a body up an aperture so forcibly that the united vigor of several persons was found barely sufficient to drag it down. Turn now to other indications of the employment of a vigor most marvelous. On the hearth there were thick tresses, very thick tresses, of gray human hair. These had been torn out by the roots. You are aware of the great force necessary in tearing from the head even 20 or 30 hairs together. You saw the locks in question as well as myself. Their roots, a hideous sight, were clotted with fragments of the flesh of the scalp, sure token of the prodigious power which had been exerted in uprooting perhaps 500,000 of hairs at a time. The throat of the old lady was not merely cut, but the head absolutely severed from the body. The instrument was a mere razor. I wish you also to look at the brutal ferocity of these deeds. Of the bruises on the body of Madame L'Espagne I do not speak. Monsieur Dumas and his worthy coadjutor Monsieur Etienne have pronounced that they were inflicted by some obtuse instrument, and so far these gentlemen are very correct. The obtuse instrument was clearly the stone pavement in the yard upon which the victim had fallen from the window which looked in upon the bed. This idea, however simple it may now seem, escaped the police for the same reason that the breadth of the shutters escaped them, because, by the affair of the nails, their perceptions had been hermetically sealed against the possibility of the windows having been opened at all. If now, in addition to all these things, you have been properly reflected upon the odd disorder of the chamber, we have gone so far as to combine the ideas of an agility astounding, a strength superhuman, a ferocity brutal, a butchery without motive, a grotesquerie in horror absolutely alien from humanity, and a voice foreign in tone to the ears of men of many nations, and devoid of all distinct and intelligible sibilification. What result, then, has ensued? What impression have I made upon your fancy? I felt a creeping of the flesh as Dupin asked me the question. A madman, I said, has done this deed. Some raving maniac escaped from the neighboring Maison des Saints. In some respects, he replied, your idea is not irrelevant. But the voices of madmen, even in their wildest paroxysms, are not found to tally with that peculiar voice heard upon the stairs. Madmen are of some nation, and their language, however incoherent in its words, has always the coherence of syllabification. Besides, the hair of a madman is not such as I now hold in my hand. I disentangled this little tuft from the rigidly clutched fingers of Madame L'Espagne. Tell me what you make of it. Dupin, I said, completely unnerved. This hair is most unusual. This is no human hair. Thank you once again for joining us today at the Pawtuxet General. If you would like to reach out with a question, comment, recipe, or local ghost story, our email is jess@pawtuxetgeneral.com. Reach out, we can't wait to hear from you, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. But until then, I'll meet you right back here next time at the Pawtuxet General. A Something for Posterity production, pre-recorded in Pawtuxet.